Hello everyone, I'm Prabhakar Gopalan, and along with me, Josh Duncan and Roger Colvin, we organize Product Austin. Thank you so much for showing up today. I know the weather is bad outside, but thanks. Since this is a topic about growth, we want to say we're at 826 members on Meetup today. So, we hope you can bring your friends, your colleagues, and network to future Product Austin Meetup. Our goal is to build and market a holistic product. And so whatever we learn here, hopefully we can take it back to work. I will, a warm welcome to Brian Balfour from HubSpot. I'm sure, you guys have heard a lot about him, so give a round of applause. And thank you. Josh Duncan has a few things to say.
Yes, thank you. Thanks, Brock. Again, I'm Josh Duncan. Real quick, who here this is their first Product Austin meetup? Can you raise your hands? That's awesome. All right, I'm going to take a picture of this. All right, well, welcome. I think this is like our 6th or 7th one. We've had a great list of speakers. I plan to continue that going forward. Very excited to hear Brian's talk tonight. Just a quick couple logistics. There is a Wi-Fi password, I think, in that little piece of paper up on the wall. I can't read it, but if you're wanting to get on the Wi-Fi, the Capital Factor Wi-Fi, there's a free Wi-Fi, and you can tweet and share pictures. It's at Product Austin or hashtag Product Austin. Love to see you share comments or awesome things that Brian's going to say. That'll show up on the screen here. You're going to get lots of love from all your colleagues when you appear up there and admiration. Also, to help variety of your participation, there's 2 door prizes. I think there's some Kindle ebooks that are going to be given away at the end for most active Twitter person and had best questions for Brian at the end during the Q&A. So again, big thanks to Capital Factory. They're one of our big sponsors here and help provide the facilities, the mics, all the good screens and stuff like that. Craftsman PM, Prabhakar, help sponsor again the pizza and all the food, so check out craftsmanpm.com. And with that, I'm proud to introduce Brian, VP of Growth at HubSpot and also founder of several companies themselves. I think it's going to be a great growth conversation, kind of his experiences. So I'm going to let Brian take it away and then we'll do some questions at the end. Thanks, Brian.
Awesome. Thanks for having me. All right. So, what I'm going to talk about today is basically building a growth machine. And so, as you mentioned, I'm the VP of Growth at HubSpot. Most people know HubSpot as a company that helps with marketing and marketing software. What we're going through as a transition as a company is not just about marketing, but a company that helps other companies grow. And that comes down to a lot of things, more than just marketing, but things about like marketing, sales, hiring, all sorts of stuff. And so I actually work in a new division that's building new products with new models, more of like a B2C model than a B2B model, with a bunch of other things. And so we're actually rewriting the growth playbook within HubSpot. And what I want to talk about today is basically that process that we're going through in terms of rewriting that playbook for these new products and these new audiences. Prior to HubSpot, I had started a couple companies, one called Viximo in the social gaming heyday. We got to about 5 million daily active users, ended up selling it to Tapjoy. Started a B2C education company, which just sold to Valor. We got that to about 4 million users per month. And we're going through the same process here with HubSpot today. And so really when it comes down to what we're all doing in terms of building companies, whether it's an early stage startup or a late stage company, is there's really about one mission, one goal. And that's what I would call saying building authentic growth. And so what is authentic growth? And a big component of it that I try to get across is growth does not equal acquisition. A lot of people think about growth as just basically driving awareness and acquisition at sort of the top of the funnel. And growth is really about being and covering this funnel in a very holistic way, right? Because we can increase any piece of this funnel to increase growth. We can increase acquisition, we can increase activation, we can improve our retention rates, we can get more users to invite other users, and all these things will help your active user base and company grow. And so looking at this in a very holistic way, designing an organization and a team and a process around this principle is kind of what I want to talk about today. Because if we don't go after authentic growth, what we get into the habit of is what I would call the wheel of meaningless growth, right? And this is commonly seen in the space by a lot of companies, what I would call celebrating vanity metrics externally, they're either pursuing PR or attention in some other way, shape, or form, and so they come up with the biggest number that they can find. They put it out there, and what happens is once you start celebrating that externally, you start celebrating those metrics internally, and once you start celebrating them internally, you start pursuing those vanity metrics as goals. At the end of this, it's just basically game over. And so a lot of people ask, well, if growth is about this holistic funnel, all of these pieces of the funnel, what is the real big difference of growth and product? And we can break it down into a very simple framework. And our job between these two teams is really three things. One, it's building core value of that product, getting the largest percentage of our target audience to experience that core value as quickly as possible, and then getting users to experience that core value as often as possible. And so the way that we sort of frame our teams and design our teams is that our product teams are really about the first bucket. How do we build that core value in the product? And then growth is largely about these last two buckets of like, how do we get this in front of our audience as quickly as possible, and how do we get them to experience that core value as often as possible? And so another way to sort of explain these growth efforts and how it's a little bit different than product or how we traditionally think about marketing, it's kind of this graph here. So any good product, especially B2C products, if you just build a great product and put it out there, you typically end up with this natural adoption curve. You can keep iterating on the product. Other users will invite other users, maybe word of mouth, it'll get out there, and it'll keep growing sort of naturally. But what that doesn't represent is basically what I would call the true growth potential of a product, sort of this line as you see here. And so our purpose as a growth team in our growth efforts is really about how do we get our company and our product from the bottom line up to the top line through a number of iterations and efforts. And so a lot of people kind of see this effort as this giant mystical sort of effort, or it comes down to like these magical growth hacks or pursuing these singular tactics or secrets that nobody knows about. And hopefully the one thing that you'll take away at sort of the end of this is that it has actually nothing to do with any of those things. And growth is actually a very systematic process of basically breaking things down into actionable pieces, figuring out ideas to attack those actionable pieces, and of course prioritizing and implementing them efficiently. And so learning how to do this, learning how to grow authentically, actually has nothing to do with tactics. It has nothing to do with how we're running Facebook ads or the best creative or how to write headlines or none of that stuff. It has everything to do with what I call process. And a lot of people, especially in the startup space, kind of look at me when I mention this word process and they're like, what the hell can be so special about process, right? Like very allergic reaction to this word. And so there's really 4 reasons to focus on process first and tactics second. That first reason is what works for others won't work for you. And your audience is different, your product is different, your business model is different, your customer journey is different. Bottom line, plain and simple, your business is different. And so instead of basically going out there and trying to seek out what works for others and basically copying and applying to your business, what we really are focusing on is how do we build a repeatable process that uncovers the tactics that actually work for you and kind of pieces together all of these unique variables and pieces into a cohesive strategy that is custom and specific to your business. The second reason we really focus on process first and tactics second is that growth is the sum of a lot of small parts. And so we see these types of growth curves all over the place in TechCrunch and on startups and VentureBeat. And we always tend to really want to focus on this point. It's kind of like, what was that one thing that they did before this explosive growth happened? And what we should really all be asking is about what are all these little things that kind of led up to that point, and then what are all the things that we did to keep that momentum afterwards? Because at the end of the day, and probably something you've heard before, is that growth, like silver bullets, do not exist. We will certainly have things that we do that are outliers, but typically those outliers are the product of doing a lot of small things, learning from a lot of small things, adding those learnings up over time to produce a big outlier. The third reason that we really focus on process first and tactics second is that the rate of change is accelerating. And this is a huge macro trend in technology right now that I think a lot about and I actually worry a lot about. And so if we look at kind of these 4 big channels, what we would probably consider mature channels within technology, all 4 of them have gone through fundamental changes just in the past 18 months. And in fact, I created this slide, I think 6 months ago, and this is already out of date. And so email, right, Gmail moving to tabbed inboxes, emphasizing unsubscribe at the top, implementing inbox actions. Facebook, when it worked 60 days ago is not what works today, right? And even on a more macro level, if we look at channels over time, and the credit goes to a guy named James Currier who runs Google Labs in SF, is that what we see as time goes on is more and more channels basically emerge. But the more disturbing trend is that the time between their peak effectiveness and then depreciation becomes smaller and smaller. It's becoming faster and faster, right? And so if you take that into account, you think about that, you basically need to make sure you have a system, a process to basically continually experiment and uncover the things that are going to be working and be on that bleeding edge, because whatever you discover today is probably not going to be working 60, 90, 120 days from now. The last but not least, the reason we focus on process first and tactics second is that we're looking to build a machine. And a machine is kind of defined, I define it as 3 things, is that it's scalable, right? So no point in doing something if it's not going to help us do a lot of growth in a very efficient way. It's predictable, right? So we kind of know based on what we put in, what about we're going to get out, and it's repeatable. We can do it more and more and more. And so the way that I frame this is that the machine is what produces the tactics, sort of that output. And the process, which I'm about to talk about, is kind of what produces the machine. And so as we dive into this, kind of like what is this process that I've used at past startups and kind of what we've used at HubSpot. To start out, there's really like 4 main goals of this process. First and most importantly is learning. And so this whole thing is kind of designed around how we constantly learn about our customers, products, and channels, and feed that learning back into the process to continually improve and get better over time. The second thing is about rhythm and cadence. And so in growth efforts, momentum is a very powerful thing. What you'll find is that it's a highly experimental process, which means just by nature, you're gonna fail a lot. And so getting through those failures as a team to get through the successes kind of requires this natural cadence and momentum to fight through. And then third and fourth is more of like a team kind of culture thing that we kind of really emphasize at HubSpot, which is autonomy and accountability. And so what we really try to design at HubSpot is basically a structure where we set goals and guardrails for the individual teams, but it's up to the individuals to decide what they work on to achieve those goals. At the same time, they're being kind of held accountable to all of those things. And so at a very high level, and this is a little hard to consume at first, but I'm going to walk through it step by step, is this is what the process looks like. And so what you'll see here in the top 3 stages, which I'll talk about, we kind of do this every 60 to 90 days, these top 3 stages. And then the cycle that you kind of see at the bottom is basically what we're doing on a daily and a weekly basis. And so the first step of this process is all about finding levers. And the main goal of this step, the very first step, is all about how do we find the highest impact area that we can focus on right now, given limited resources, right? So even at HubSpot, a public company with a $1.5 billion market cap, we have limited resources, right? That never goes away, no matter how big of a company, no matter how much funding you have, right? And so a lot of growth is about how do we do things in the right order of operations in the most efficient way possible. And so we actually put time into, rather than basically taking a shotgun or a spray and pray approach, is how do we really emphasize picking out kind of the highest impact area that we can focus on right now. And so a lot of this comes down to how we take metrics, break those metrics down into actionable pieces, and then actually estimate what is the biggest lever that we can pull in the business. And so I'm going to walk through an example. This is for a product that we're spending a lot of time on right now called Sidekick. It's like a B2C tool that kind of plugs into your email. And our goal as a team is what we call weekly active users, or WAUs. And so we could sit there as a team, right, and say, what affects weekly active users? What can we do to improve weekly active users? But there's a big problem with that question. That question is way too big, right? There are a million different things that we could potentially do to affect weekly active users. And so what we need to do is start breaking it down to a level where we can actually start to take action on it. And so how do we break down weekly active users? Well, we take weekly active users and start expressing it as a simple math equation. And the first part of that math equation is basically just new activated users that we acquire every week, plus the amount of users that we retain from all previous weeks. Okay, so now we've broken it down to one level. We're getting a little bit more detailed here. And so now we can possibly ask the question, okay, well, what are all the things that we can do to increase new activated users, or what are all the things that we could do to increase our retained users? The challenge is that question's still too big, right? There's still too many things that we could possibly do to affect one of those two things. So we want to try to break it down even further. And so we take that new activated number, right, and break it down into smaller components. And we can express that as a math equation where we say the number of users we acquire via Facebook ads times their activation rate, add in the number of users we acquire via invite and viral channels times that activation rate, add in the people we get from content, direct, all these other sources, right? Keep building that out over and over. And so now we're starting to actually get somewhere, but we're still not done, right? We can break that down even further, right? So now we can take sort of the registered users that we get from virality, for example, and we can break that down even farther and say, well, that's really a function of taking the number of impressions that hit our invite page times the conversion of that page times the invites per user times the click-through rate of the invite email times the landing page conversion rate. Now we're really somewhere, right? Because we could sit here and say, well, if impressions to that invite page basically help us, what are a bunch of ideas that we can do to increase impressions of that page, right? That's a much more actionable question that we can answer with some very easy ideas to implement and test, and that we can do very quickly. Knowing that basically if those ideas work and help increase that one little variable, it should flow all the way back up into what our North Star metric is, which is weekly active users. And we can do this over and over again with every single variable in here, right? Like we can go back up and do the same thing with retained users, where retained users is basically the number of users I acquired last week times, the percentage that, we retain 1 week later, and do that with 2 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago, 4 weeks ago, keep going back. The point is that once you kind of identify sort of this big metric, is to break it down into its biggest pieces, because what we're going to do with these pieces is build a growth model. And so this is just a screenshot of a giant Excel sheet that we have. And we build this into a growth model and basically drag this model out a full year, sometimes 2 years in advance. And we look at three things. We look at our baseline. So we go through every variable in the model and we say, where are we at currently today? Like what does this look like in our business today? The second thing we do is we ask, well, what's the potential ceiling? Like based on kind of like what we know about our product and our users and our own intuition, where do we think we could get that number to? And then if we actually increase that number to our ceiling, what is the sensitivity of that variable in the model over time? And so the third one's really important because basically, we could be looking at working on two things, maybe increasing the conversion rate of one of our sign-up landing pages, or we could be, working on something in our invite and referral and virality mechanism. Well, the thing about the invite and the referral mechanism is those things kind of compound over time when you look at it in the model, and they actually have a much bigger effect when you drag it out 6 months, a year from now, versus working on that conversion rate of the sign-up page. And so we look at these three things once again to ultimately answer that question: what is the highest impact thing that we can work on right now given limited resources? Because we really want to focus in and sort of narrow in on that. And once we do that, we basically set goals. And the goal framework that we use is OKRs, called Objective and Key Results. This was developed by Intel, popularized at Google, Zynga, a bunch of West Coast companies, right? The big part is that there's three components. We set a qualitative objective. Basically, this is like the why behind the goal. We set a time frame, 30 to 90 days, that we're going to focus on this impact area that we identified. And that time frame is specific because anything shorter than 30 days, we're probably not giving ourselves enough time to have a real meaningful impact. Anything longer than 90 days, we're probably biting off more than we can possibly chew. And then we set 3 KRs, 3 key results. And these are quantitative, measurable metrics that basically tell us that we are achieving the objective, right? And there's a big part of these KRs is that they increase in order of difficulty. And so as we go through setting these goals throughout the year, we try to set them so that we hit our KR1s about 90% of the time, and our KR3s about 10% of the time, only about once a year. And so that provides us a very good barometer of saying, well, if we're always hitting our KR3s, then we're obviously sandbagging our goals, right? We're not setting aggressive enough goals, right? And if we're never hitting our KR1s, then we're either being way too unrealistic, which is very unmotivating for the team, or we don't understand something about our business. And if we don't understand about our business to set somewhat, accurate goals, then there's something else that we need to find out and figure out. And so a good example of this is that, sometime last year on our Sidekick product is that we wanted to make our referral or invite, our virality mechanism, a meaningful acquisition channel for us. And so we set a time frame of 90 days. And we set this metric, which is basically the number of new users we acquire via viral divided by our weekly active user base. It gives us a percentage of basically how many users our active user base is generating on a weekly basis. And so we set goals after this and went after it. And so there's 3 things about these goals, which I'll talk a little bit more about number 1 in a second. But number 2 is we try to keep them in our face, some constant reminder among the entire team, review them daily, weekly, but more importantly is they're concrete. And so we very rarely change these goals mid-OKR period. And that comes back to that first point, right, about finding that highest impact area. If you're going to spend some time on figuring out what that highest impact area is, you probably shouldn't be changing your goals that often. If you are, then you're basically just kind of whiplashing the team back and forth. However, it's not like we never change them. There are some instances where huge opportunities come up or major fire alarms where we have to sort of change our goals and change course. But it's very rare that we actually do that. And so after we set these goals as a team, we kind of go on to this 3rd step. And that's what I call basically basic data exploration. And as a team, we look at 3 things, right? There's this whole question in the space about, is growth and customer acquisition, is that an art or science? And my answer to that question is always that it's neither. Oh, I didn't even realize you guys didn't have that up here. That sucks. Are they fixing that?
That's what I'm working on.
Oh, okay. Do you want me to pause? Or do you want me to
Keep going.
You want me to keep going? Okay. All right. Okay. So basically, as a team, when we come.
Sorry, you can also look on your phone, live stream.
Yeah. All right. So as a team, basically, when it comes to data exploration, like I was mentioning, it's like I said, it's not purely quantitative and it's not purely sort of a creative endeavor. Is we really try to blend these 3 things. Is basically quantitative information, qualitative information, and some of our own intuition. And the blend of those 3 things forms this Venn diagram, and this is really where we get our insights from and how we direct ourselves. And so there's multiple ways that we sort of do this. So like on the quantitative side, basically, we have a lot of data, whether it's in Google Analytics, Mixpanel, our own data store. And the real goal is to basically use that quantitative data to break this focus area down into pieces and understand a little bit more deeply what's going on. On the qualitative side, we do a lot of what I call one-to-one emails. So we will identify usage using quantitative data, basically to identify usage behaviors in the user base, and send them one-to-one very personal emails asking them why they basically did that behavior. Right, so a good example is we recently were focusing on our onboarding and week 1 retention in the product. And what we noticed is that a lot of users were basically just installing the product and then sending one email. And that was really weird to us. It was, oh no. Oh, there we go. All right. Anyway, so we send these one-to-one emails, and so that user group, we said, well, hey, it looks like you installed Sidekick, but you only sent one email with it. We were just wondering why. We'd love brutally honest feedback. Let us know. And we collect all of this qualitative information, typically hundreds of responses in the matter of 48 hours. We engage those people over email. We ask them why. We're like, that's interesting. Please tell me more. And we take all these responses and we sort of categorize it into different buckets. And so when we did this once with like our invite and referral mechanism, we had all of these categories emerge. We had people saying, well, they didn't really know who to invite, or the reward wasn't high enough for inviting other users. And this might seem very simple, but this actually starts to break it down into understanding that focus area we chose, like why users are behaving in a certain way. And we can start, and what you'll see next is that we can start to really brainstorm ideas against this, right? And so we know that 35% of the people said they didn't know who to invite. Well, what if we suggest a bunch of people to invite? And then what if we play with that suggestion, prioritizing coworkers over like personal contacts and other things? What if we played and A/B tested with like the amount of free months they got in the product for inviting users? How does that affect things? Point is we use this quantitative and qualitative data to basically understand a little bit more about the direction that we want to take with the next step, which is really this first step, which is our ideas, our brainstorms. And so there's one big thing about our brainstorms, and that's we brainstorm on the inputs, not the outputs. Right? So all that qualitative data that we collected and all those categories, that's one element of inputs. The other element of inputs are basically going back to that model and that math equation, right? And so if we want to increase something like our activation rate in our onboarding process, we're not going to sit there and ask, like, what are a bunch of ideas to increase activation rate? We're going to say, well, that activation rate is actually a function of 3 different onboarding steps. Let's look at every single step. Let's come up with a bunch of ideas for how we could improve each individual step. And then let's go back and look at the whole process, right? Or the whole funnel. And once again, basically breaking it down into these and brainstorming on these makes it much more actionable and much more easier to come up with very impactful ideas. And so there's 4 ways that we do this. There's 4 ways we come up with ideas. These are basic exercises. I stole them from a book called The Innovator's Solution. Great book, you should read it. But the first is basically observing. And so we'll get in a room, everybody's assigned like 2 or 3 products, non-competitive products, very different products in the space, and they look at how others are sort of doing it. And we walk through it together and we talk about what we like, what they're doing, what we don't like. And typically through that process, we'll generate and absorb like a bunch of ideas of how we might be able to apply it and use that as inspiration on our own product. The second piece is that we do a lot of questioning. We do something called question storming, or question brainstorming. Is like, we'll take that specific area, like, basically increasing invites or referrals, and basically we do nothing but ask questions for 15 or 20 minutes. Questions like, out of the users who are inviting, why are they inviting? Who are they, who are they inviting? Is it their coworkers? Is it personal users? The users who get to that page and then don't convert, why don't they convert? Right? Like all these questions, because basically any good idea, any good solution is going to start with a really good question. And so at the end of this exercise, we'll end up with a whole list of questions. We prioritize that list of questions, and then we'll go and try to find some of the answers. And typically those answers start to lead to a bunch of ideas. We do a couple other things, association, and of course, like networking. I spend a lot of my time networking with other people in this space to get ideas. But the point is like we have specific exercises that the team can always come back to. And so they should never be stuck for ideas. Like they always know how to go generate more really good ideas. And so ideas for us is never the problem. The real problem is prioritizing. And so we end up with this massive list of ideas. And so there's a real question of like, once again, that order of operations, like how do we choose the right ideas to work on? And so we evaluate against 3 things. The first thing is probability. And so we assign each idea basically a low, medium, or high rating. High probability, this is basically probability we think the experiment will be successful. And so The high rating would be, an idea that was based off of a learning from a previous experiment, as an example, right? Something that we're fairly knowledgeable about. A low rating would be like we're entering into totally new territory, and we don't really know anything about sort of this area of our product or this channel or this piece, and so we'll assign it a low rating. I'll come back to impact in a second, but of course we also estimate resources very quick. It's like, this is going to take us 1 hour, half day, 1 day, 1 week for each one of these things. But the second and the most important part is actually impact. And so we'll actually predict the impact we think this experiment, this idea is going to have on the variable that we are trying to influence. And this very much comes in a very simple hypothesis statement, basically saying, if this experiment is successful, this variable in our growth model will increase by this much because, and we list out all of our assumptions. And those assumptions can come from multiple places, right? They can come from quantitative data that we sort of explored. It can come from qualitative data, either surveys or support emails, right? So saying, in our one-to-one emails, we found this area to be the biggest response, and therefore, the point is basically, we don't attack ideas blindly. We actually go through the thought process to say what impact we think it'll have on our product, on our users, on our growth, because as we'll see in step 5, this helps us learn more. And learning is sort of the key to all of this. And so as we come up with this hypothesis, we'll throw it and we create, it's a Google Doc, we call it an experiment document, and we'll list out sort of the hypothesis and a place to start recording all of this. After we do that, we basically design what we call a minimum viable test. So a lot of people are probably familiar with the lean startup model. And the point of a minimum viable test is basically, what is the most efficient but valid way that we can understand our hypothesis, right? And these two things have to be present, right? Like, we could come up with like a very efficient smokescreen test, but it might not actually give us valid data around the hypothesis that we're trying to learn about, right? That's a waste of time for us. And so when we attack sort of an idea, right? Like, if we never had a user invite system sort of existing in our product, and we had this hypothesis that it could be a major channel for us, we're not going to go build out this super complicated invite mechanism, right? We're going to throw up some calls to action, maybe a landing page, see how many people convert on that landing page, and then throw them up, this feature's in beta or something like that. That gives us data around how many potential people might engage within this feature and what we might get out of it before we go through all of the engineering effort to fully build it out. And so as we design this minimum viable test, we kind of list it out in this experiment doc. This typically takes a product manager or an engineer maybe about 5 minutes. And the point of listing out this test, once again, is to make sure as other people look at this experiment, people can challenge, is this the most efficient way to do it? Are we going to get valid data out of this experiment design? But after we design that test, we basically go implement it, right? This is pretty self-explanatory. And then most importantly, after we implement this minimum viable test, we analyze, right? And this is the most important part because, once again, this is where we get the learnings. And we look at 3 different things. We look at, is this thing a success or a failure, right? Like, did this thing actually have a positive effect on the variable that I was trying to influence? What was the actual impact? Like, how close to our prediction were we? How close to our assumptions were we? Were we spot on or were we way off? And then most importantly, and this is the toughest question to answer, is why? Why did we see those results that we did? And the answer to why is where we really start to learn about our product and our users and our channels. And typically asking that question results in a couple things, right? We'll either come up with, we'll either have pretty definitive learnings, pretty close idea of understanding why something happened, or we'll end up coming up with a few more hypotheses of why we think something happened, and those hypotheses lead to new experiments. And of course, the new experiments help us sort of validate sort of additional learnings. But we take these learnings and we kind of record them within this experiment doc, so that we kind of build sort of a repository of these learnings and build on our learnings over time. especially as we grow the team and add new members to the team, so that there's a corpus of knowledge for people to sort of stand on the shoulders of rather than starting from scratch. And then sort of step 6 after this is, if an experiment is successful, we'll do one of two things with it. We'll either productize it in the product, anything that we can solve with technology and automate with technology, we'll put in the product. Or the second thing that we do is if we can't solve it with technology, so if it's something with like our content marketing, for example, we build it into what we call playbooks. And these are just sort of step-by-step guides or checklists that sort of the team follows to make sure that they're basically repeating successes. And of course, at the end of this is we go through this over and over and over again. And the most important part of this is basically we take the learnings that we have from step 5 and we feed it back into our prioritization step, right? And so as we learn new things, ideas in our backlog, certain ideas in our backlog will become invalidated. Some other ones look like better ideas based on those learnings. And we're constantly sort of adjusting this backlog as we move forward to make sure that we're working on the things that probably have the highest probability of success and the biggest impact. And so for the team, for the individual team members, what does a week look like? On Mondays, we have our weekly growth meeting, which I'll talk about in a second. That's the only meeting that we have as a team. The rest of the week is spent on all of these other steps. They're either going through the predicting, the prioritizing, the implementing. The majority of the time is either spent on the implementation or the analysis phase of the process. And in these weekly growth meetings, we look at a few things. And the most important thing is that we do not talk about what we did last week or what we're going to do this week. All we talk about is learnings. And the reason we do that is we really, as just like humans, we have this tendency to get attached to our own ideas. And this process and growth is all about how do you detach yourself from ideas and look at these ideas in a very unbiased way. We found in the past by talking about the ideas themselves and like the what we're doing and what we want, people tend to get more attached to them. So what we emphasize more is basically what is the impact in the learnings that we are having and how do we distribute those learnings across the team, especially as the team grows. Because if any of you are in sort of larger organizations, what you probably realize is that learnings about your users and your channels and your products start to live in silos among individual teams. And that's a big problem because learnings can be, a learning from one team could possibly be applied across the funnel in sort of different areas. So if we find sort of like basically a theme of copy that helps us convert users, at the top of the funnel with our paid acquisition, right? We could probably go try that theme of that copy and that method of persuasion in other places in our product, whether it's our retention emails or that invite page, getting users to convert on an invite page, along with other places. So big goal of this meeting is, once again, focus on the learnings and the impact and how we distribute those things across the team. And then maybe about 5 minutes of the meeting we'll spend on, just reviewing our goals and how we're kind of doing against them, as well as if there's any major blocking items for the team. And so this is, we use a template for our weekly growth meeting once again. So we're building this corpus of knowledge. It's really simple. It's, typically team members spend about a half hour on a Monday morning, sort of contributing to this doc. And then the meeting is like another 30 to 45 minutes. And so about every quarter, probably once every 3 to 4 months, we take a step back and we do team offsites and we look at a bunch of different things. We look at, we're not only trying to optimize our product and our users for growth, right? We're trying to optimize ourselves for growth as a team. And so we measure this process and the effectiveness of this solution on a few things. We look at things like our batting average. So out of our list of experiments, how many successes to failures, but more importantly, are we improving over time, especially in a focus area? The second thing we look at is like accuracy, right? So like in a 90-day goal period, an OKR period, we should be getting more and more accurate as we keep going because we should be learning more and more and applying those learnings back into the process. And then the third is just throughput, right? Like how many experiments are we running in a given time period? How do we do more? And there's really 3 ways that we can sort of influence these macro metrics as a team. We can improve our team, right? Either add members to the team, improve our current team skill sets. The second thing is infrastructure. So as the team grows and we get better and better at this, we build certain tools that help us run these types of experiments, get data, get learnings out of the system much faster. And the third is, of course, how do we keep refining and iterating on this process to make it more and more efficient over time. I have sort of 3 final words, and these are typically, they're in response to a lot of common questions I get. And that is, a lot of people kind of see this process and they say, well, if you're just iterating the whole time, are you just making incremental changes? And one of the things I want to emphasize is that iteration does not equal incremental for us. And so we might, kind of the way that I sort of explain it is, or the best analogy I heard from a guy at Atlassian was, growth is very much about a game of Battleship, right? You kind of send these pings across the board, right, to sort of start narrowing on your target. You send these pings in kind of the most efficient way, but once you find that target, you freaking explode that target to your maximum ability, right? And so a lot of these experiments are the same thing. It's kind of like sending these pings out to sort of fish around to find, where your battleships are that you can destroy and really cause sort of some really big impact. And then I think the second thing is we're always pushing the team, right? Going back to how we prioritize is that a big part of the prioritization is about impact, right? So if we have, basically sort of like a medium probability thing, but we think it might have a really high impact, we'll take on sort of that little bit more of a meaty project over maybe some smaller impact kind of medium probability items, right? So it's always, that's part of the art of growth is like, how do you, there is no strict science to this. There is no way to score all your ideas with a single metric. It's like, how do you look at these 3 things in a very structured way and start balancing them over time to pick kind of the most impactful things, given the amount of resources that you have. The second thing is that I always get this question, especially from early stage startups, is, well, like, yeah, that's great. Like, you've got a team doing this, but our company is like only 5 dudes. Like, how much of this do I really need to do? And my answer to that is typically more than you probably think. And so what I find with a lot of really early stage startups is that they tend to they take a shotgun approach. They have all of these sort of ideas and they sort of spread themselves thin across a bunch of different growth ideas, and you never really dig in multiple ways, right? You never scratch beyond the surface. You never really dig in to learn why something's working or not working, right? And that's really where the progress lies, right? Is digging into those things. And so this framework, this process, even the things like the documents, right? The main advantage of like documenting this stuff or having the specific process is not like having a record of knowledge. It's basically a forcing function for us to think through the things that we know will make us successful over time, right? So like always looking at ideas and prioritizing them, to apples, taking these big growth metrics and breaking them down into actionable pieces. When something fails, right, before we move on, actually stopping to ask the question why. Like these are the things that we tend to pass over when we're just sort of kind of operating on our own in La La Land. So like I said, it's never too early to basically start this process. And then a final word. The other thing is that, like I mentioned, there's nothing special about this process. As you guys probably have seen, it's part lean startup, it's part scientific method, it's part kind of some of like our own unique stuff that we've taken from growth and applied to it. Success actually comes down to grit, focus, and persistence. And so the teams that I find that are most successful are the ones that have the grit and have the focus to do the things like not be attached to their ideas, look at their ideas in a very unbiased way, admit their failures. And when something does fail, actually dig in and ask the question why and really look for the right answer because they know that learning is going to basically feed back into their process. And so, like I said, growth is not a mystical thing, right? It's this systematic process of taking things, breaking it down into actionable pieces, and then finding the most efficient ways to test and learn from those ideas. And that's it. I'll take a bunch of questions.
Good deal. Forgot to mention this at the start. There's a live stream going on, so I think we do have a few people will be online. So what I'll do here is I'll start off the first question, and if you just want to raise your hand, I'll walk around and pass the mic around so people can hear it. So Brian, you mentioned kind of at the start or at the end here about small teams getting started with growth. I was wondering if you could answer the question or give us a little bit of history of growth at HubSpot. How do you kind of go from an organization that's getting started to the point where you kind of have a VP of growth, and how does that kind of role play with the rest of the organization?
Yeah, so I think, yes, this naturally evolves over time, right? So like in like a very early stage startup, I would dedicate one person, probably one of the founders, to growth, right? And that should be the thing that they eat, breathe, and sleep all day long. It's like, how do I get this thing to grow? And to be honest, that's how I started off at HubSpot. I was, we were forming this sort of new division around these new products. It was 6 people. I was the only growth person. I was running all of the Facebook ads, like all of this stuff. And as the team grew and grew, right, we started to identify sort of different needs sort of on the team, right? And as really the second stage is going from kind of like that one person to how do I establish sort of like a mini growth team? And that mini growth team typically, the types of people involved look very different, but there's a common set of skills that you have to have represented to really basically operate this process and implement experiments super efficiently. And those skills are basically, you need engineering skills, you need design skills, you need data skills, and you need marketing skills. Because ultimately it's all 4 of those things that are blended together to basically come up with effective ideas, execute those ideas very efficiently. Sometimes you can find that in 2 people, right? You might find a really talented full stack engineer that can also like look at data in a big way, and a second person can look at it from more of like a marketing design perspective. Sometimes that's 3 people, sometimes that's 4 people. It really depends sort of on the mixture of people, but it's really about those 4 elements kind of combined together in a cohesive way with one mission, which is how do we grow this thing, right? And it's not just about how do we grow this thing at the top of the funnel, but it's like looking at this as a holistic picture, and once again, picking out where the highest leverage areas of opportunity are and really focusing and executing on those highest leverage areas. From there, the third stage is obviously how you go to a team where we are now, where we've got like multiple pods of growth teams, or like you look at the teams at Airbnb and Atlassian and, Facebook and Uber, their growth teams are over 100 people each, right? And there you're getting into probably what I would call the biggest question in growth right now, because every team out there, the bigger teams, they operate very differently, they're structured very differently. And they interact with other pieces of the org very differently. And it's a very complicated, hairy question. I don't think as like a community in technology, we've actually really figured out the larger organizational structure questions when it comes to developing really big growth organizations. I'm happy to talk about that more, but it really depends if somebody has more questions or interest in that.
I have a question about how many variables do you test at any given time? Is it within, let's say, 30 to 90 days, do you just test one variable, or do you run multiple experiments?
We run a lot of experiments. So I think since April of last year, we've ran about 1,300 experiments on one product. And so let me go back real quick to give an example. So let's say like we chose sort of that virality, that invite metric as our biggest area of influence, right? In understanding sort of that data stage, what we're going to do is basically build what we call a mini model. It's the same exact thing as like that big model I showed you, but it's more specific. So if we set our OKRs or our goals around the number of new activated users we get from our viral channel, we'll break that down again into like, what are all those little inputs, right? Well, that comes down to like the impressions I get to the invite page, times the conversion rate of that page, times the user sent invite, blah, 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 right? Down. We will take this mini model and we'll say, you know, within that 90-day period, which of these variables are the most impactful ones on like this goal that we've just set, right? And so, you know, for the first couple of weeks, we might say, well, actually our biggest lever right now is just driving more people to that page. We'll run maybe 2 to 3 weeks of experiments on that. We'll get some successes in there. And at some point within that 60 or 90-day period, we might say, well, we did a really good job there. Now let's focus on, let's see if we can get the number of invites sent per user up. And then we'll run some experiments on that because we think that's the highest lever in sort of this mini model. And so typically in a 60 to 90-day period, we'll cover probably, you know, it really depends on the area, but we will cover multiple variables within the model and run experiments against a bunch of them. At any given time, that also really depends. It's hard. What you want to make sure is you don't basically run 2 experiments in parallel that might actually influence each other, because then you can't actually learn from them. And so that just really depends on your focus area and how you sort of break it out. It also depends on your infrastructure. There's like open source infrastructure from Facebook and a couple other places that lets you like run these experiments within your product, log different users in these experiments, kind of randomly distribute the users across these experiments, make sure they don't conflict with one another. So partially, what you run in parallel partially depends on that as well. So.
You mentioned you mentioned active users and conversion rate as 2 metrics, and you said that there was no single metric that you could use. But isn't revenue, especially for a public company, isn't that really the ultimate metric for everything that you're doing? And you can raise it all the way up, even if it's active users or conversion rate or everything. Can't you raise it all up to revenue?
Yeah, so actually, so there's what we call like there's 2 main metrics that we use for Sidekick, for example. We use basically weekly active users and monthly recurring revenue, and the reason we don't just focus on, or we don't just use revenue as we look at those 2 metrics as like a big picture indicator of the health of the business and where it's going. We don't look at just revenue because in Sidekick it's a freemium business. It's sort of a delayed, right? Like people can sign up, they can use the products, and they won't upgrade for like 3 or 4 months later. So it's kind of like a lagging indicator for us in the business, which is why we pair it with weekly active users. The most important point though is like, once again, it's a good picture of them. It's a good indicator of the macro picture, right? But the problem with that is there's so many things that influence those 2 metrics. Is that focusing the team on that is really difficult, right? Because they would be running all over the place in sort of different areas, whether it's virality or retention or activation rate or conversion rate, right? Like there's so many things that they can do, which is why it comes down to understanding what are the inputs to those outputs, and then focusing the team around those, like how do you influence those inputs and learn about those inputs, how you learn about those inputs over time. I think the second thing is a lot of times those top line metrics, while once again, a good holistic overall health of the business, they hide a lot of things. And like, so like a good example is retention. Like your weekly active, like our weekly active users could be going up for a while because we're acquiring a bunch of people at the top of the funnel, but maybe, you know, month 3, month 4, month 5, like our retention is just going like this, right? And we're not retaining any user. We could be growing that weekly active user number for months until we get to a point that it starts flatlining because we're actually not retaining users from 3 or 4 months ago. So like I said, like it's really important to understand, like, you know, some people call it their North Star. There's other sort of the one metric that matters. There's a bunch of names for it. It's important to sort of set that thing and make sure that that metric is a holistic representation of that funnel, and to track that over time. But it's more about how do you use that metric as a starting point to break it down into what its inputs are and to figure out what the actual inputs are into the business.
Hey, so I have a question. I do marketing for an event management and ticketing company, and one of the big issues that we've had is our lag time, as you said, can be extremely long, and sometimes, you know, someone will like create an event and then like 4 months later they'll actually make it. But the problem is that they're not technically a weekly active user. So how would you recommend reconciling those two things? I know it's kind of a unique situation, but we do have that issue where like there might be like a 4-month lag time, but they're not also like a weekly active user because they make the event and they kind of...
Yeah. Well, I think the first thing I would say is weekly active user is probably not the right metric for you, right? Like you'd have to, you know, we chose that metric for Sidekick specifically based on a few elements, right? Like when I started, we basically looked at and said, we said, well, first of all, we defined what an active user was. Like what are the actions that they take that basically tell us that we are delivering value to them, right? And for us, that was like they were, we have a couple different features, but they're basically that they were sending emails with the product installed and they were getting sort of value out of it. But then we looked at the time frame, right, too, and we said, well, like we're targeting this audience of professionals that kind of uses their email, they kind of live in their email all day long, right? So what if we set our big goal as monthly active users, right? And somebody would qualify as a monthly active users if they took one of these actions only once in a month. If they only take this action once in that month, does that really mean we're delivering real value to that user? Probably not, right? The other extreme of that is we also ask the question, well, do they have to be using the product every single day to be getting real value out of it? And we said, no, probably not either, right? And so that's where we came up with like the weekly active user metric as for us. So that was the first one. I think you probably just I would need to know more about the business to like advise like what the right metric might be for you. But first part is like weekly active users probably isn't the right thing for you. I think the second thing is this process works the best in businesses that have extremely short feedback loops, right? And so what you'll see is like this whole growth mentality, right? This holistic approach to growth. Really, it started in B2C companies. It started with Facebook, right? And where it's most well known is B2C companies, Facebook, Uber, places like Airbnb, Wealthfront, Atlassian, all these places. But what you see over time is it's actually shifting more and more into the B2B stage of the part, because a lot of B2B companies are starting to act much more like consumer companies and taking much more consumer tactics, right, to help grow their companies. But as part of that, if you're in a business that has sort of this delay or this longer feedback cycle, I would just adjust the process differently. You might have to make changes to the process to figure out what's right for you. Usually when we work on things that we feel like have a big delay, what we do is we try to look for leading indicators as best as we can. And so, you know, a great example of that is just like I said, like our revenue just doesn't happen until 3 or 4 months later, right? And so it's not like we, like on our paid acquisition, we run a bunch of paid acquisition experiments, wait 4 months to call them a success or a failure. What we do is we kind of have different stages of success and failure. So the first success point will be basically like our cost per activated user. We kind of have a range that we know probably fits in our model, right? If it hits that range, we say success. We scale it up even farther, right? And then we look at retention, and we look at that about 3 or 4 weeks out, right? And if retention looks good, then we scale it up even farther, right? And then about 2 months in, we'll start to look at like what percentage of those users are converting, and we can start to predict like revenue on that code. That's a success. We'll scale it up, you know, we'll just blow it out of the water, right? And so we kind of deal with it in stages to mitigate risk, as well as you know, not slow down, like mitigate risk, as well as get as much throughput through the process as we possibly can.
Thank you.
How pivotal is it Hello. Okay. How pivotal is it to use something like KISS metrics or Mixpanel to analyze your growth efforts? Like, is Google Analytics enough, or is it really, necessary to have that layer on top in terms of just understanding what's working, what's not, making decisions going forward?
I would say that it's 100% necessary unless you're like a pure content site. And then Google Analytics could probably suffice for a little while. But I see them as very different products. You need sort of an event-driven analytics product to get to look at a lot of the things, to make it easy to look at a lot of the things that you need to, like retention and like down funnel metrics and a bunch of these other things. So the only exception would be like if maybe you have somebody really early on the team that is just like amazing with SQL and they have time to like do custom queries to pull the data out on a constant basis and all that kind of stuff. That would be kind of like the only exception, but that doesn't really scale because you really want to grow a culture of people kind of absorbing and looking and understanding this data and figuring out how to make decisions with it. And in order to do that, you have to increase the accessibility of it. And I think that's actually one of the biggest useful pieces of all these new analytics products out there, is that increases the accessibility to this data among the entire team, rather than having it be stuck in silos among just like a couple people. So people are shocked to hear this, but before I got to HubSpot, not a single product team had analytics installed, and I got in there and we installed it and it kind of changed the entire organization. The only reason it got HubSpot to the point that it was at was that we had this ridiculous sales and marketing machine that any feature that we built could be pumped through that machine, installed through that machine, and made successful. But my guess is if you're in startups, nobody in this room has that type of machine, and so lacking that machine, you need sort of data to make the best decisions possible.
So at the end of your presentation, you mentioned qualities such as focus and persistent that were essential to carry this through. So that sounds like difficult characteristics to get out of your team. And I was wondering how you went about that, how you enable them to learn, and I specifically don't say teach, but yeah. How do you enable them to learn to, you mentioned admit their failures and don't be attached to ideas?
The first step is we hire for it. We screen, at least for people who specifically work on growth. And so, there's differing opinions on this. I'm of the opinion that it's to be super successful at working on growth type problems requires a different type of DNA than somebody working on like core product or sort of PR and brand and buzz or whatever it might be. And part of that DNA that we look for are things like if we sense any pessimism in a person, we immediately disqualify them, right? Because we know they don't have the mentality to fight through a lot of these experiment failures and get to there. So you kind of have to have this, what I would call unbiased optimism, knowing that basically that you don't get sort of attached to sort of your ideas, right? And that you're always optimistic that if you take sort of these learnings and apply them, you will. The other thing that we look for is we look for two other things. We look for people who are very impact driven, right? And so we ask a lot of questions about like what motivates a person, right? And the type of person who's like if we're hiring a growth engineer, if they're like, well, man, I just really love building like incredible technology and like the architecture of the code and like all that kind of stuff, wrong person, right? If the answer to that is like, I just want to build something, like I love seeing people use this thing that I'm building, and we know that they're more impact driven is kind of what we call it, and so like that's a big bonus for us. And then the third is voracious learners. So we look for people who just happen to self-teach themselves kind of like all of these different things throughout their history and throughout their career. And those are kind of like the three most important. So we hire for it, we screen it from the start. We don't get it 100% correct. We've actually, removed people from our team that we've gotten wrong on that were good for other teams, right? They just weren't good for the types of problems that we were working on. And I think just within the process, a lot of people talk about this, right? But we do a lot of things we re-emphasize failure to us is not if you run a failed experiment. Failure to us is if you run an experiment and you don't learn anything. Even if you run a successful experiment and you don't learn from it, right? That's a failure because we're basically just taking stabs at it in the dark, right? And that's going back to the whole building the machine thing. That's just the completely antithesis of that. So, so we do encourage it in the culture of the team and all that stuff. But to be honest, it really starts with hiring, and we really screen for these qualities in people.
Two questions. Is this available anywhere, the deck?
Most of it is. Most of it's on my blog, which I'm happy to send out after. I'll send the direct link to it.
And then second question is, how do you deal when you have small sample size? You guys have tons of traffic, so you can run these sort of statistically significant experiments. How do you deal when you don't have that?
Yeah, so any stats background would kill me for this, right? But in the very early days of, once we have, in the very early days, we actually don't hold ourselves to the common definition of statistically significant, right? Of the p-value of 0.05 less, whatever you guys want to talk about, right? It's really about in those earliest stages, we're willing to take on more risk, right? More risk of basically potentially getting a false negative or a false positive, right? And we know that going in, we know that going in, so that's the first part is we'll reduce the requirements on what a p-value we need to have on the equation. I think the other thing in the early days is you have to take big swings, right? And the bigger swings you take typically are the bigger results that you kind of go after. Well, the bigger differences between a control and a variation, the less data you need to determine a success, right? And so that partly goes into that prioritization really early on is we specifically filter for ideas that we think will have really big impact. And then third, that also plays into where we think we might have the highest sort of leverage right now in the business, right? We might not make that decision purely based off of the growth model. We might include things do we have the right skills to run experiments in this area right now? Do we have the right amount of data, right? If we don't, then we might sort of devalue that as a priority. So those are kind of the first few things. But ultimately, companies kind of go through two stages, right? There's three stages: traction, transition, and growth. And sort of in that traction phase, part of this process is how do I just get enough data flowing through the system to start basically to start learning, right? And so how you do that really depends, right? If you're a funded company, a VC-backed company, I would actually opt for things like doing paid acquisition because you can turn volume on and off and get data flowing through the system. And basically emphasize things like learning, first over, unit economics, right? Which is really important in that stage. So there's a few different things you can do to mitigate, but it certainly plays into our decisions in terms of focus area and stuff. Well, when I started on Sidekick, we had, 6,000 users, right? We didn't have that much data, and we ran this process in sort of certain areas. We're obviously much bigger than that now, but yeah, we started that small. So.
Yeah, I don't know if this is active. We were fortunate in Austin that HubSpot came very early. Chris Justice, I don't know if you remember that, brought y'all in at one point, and we had an opportunity to watch this unfold early on. And so now that you're working on this, and you're working from this kind of a model, what is the ultimate experience that you want to reach on a repeat basis for yourselves as key people in the company who have stayed with this? You haven't flipped it, you haven't sold it. So what's next?
experience product-wise, as a company culturally, externally, like what?
Well, I know it's about revenue. You know, revenues is the given, but that's not the experience. That's the bank account.
Yeah.
And that opens opportunity. What do you want to do with that opportunity now that you have arrived at this point?
The big aim for the company is kind of what I said at the beginning, which is we want to basically build the tools, the content, and the knowledge to help other people grow, right? And what that means and what growth means, right? So the company, like I said, was very much started out as a marketing company. And it wasn't just about the software, it was about the presence in the community and the content, right? So over 2 million people sort of read the HubSpot blog per month, right? It's one of the largest content sites sort of in the US, and we very much believe that is that's as you put it, the experience. It's a big core part of the experience as a company. And so I think what you'll see coming forward is that expands from just about marketing, but to a more general thing about how do we help. We've gone through this amazing growth cycle. We want to continue to grow, but we also want to enable and help others grow sort of at the same time, because just even on the touch of marketing, we've seen how it's sort of changed, a lot of SMBs' lives. There's all these stories about a pool cleaner in, New Jersey who went from a $100,000 a year business to a $4 million a year business just by doing inbound marketing, right? And so, like, what are the other things that we can help to produce more of those types of stories?
So that, in truth, you're still on mission.
Oh, we're 100% on a mission. As a company, we firmly believe most of our growth is left ahead of us. Even as a public $1.5 billion market cap company, I personally firmly believe it, and I know the company believes that most of our growth is still ahead.
Thank you very much. Everybody give him a hand. All right, well, thanks everybody for coming. A few things here. The first is we have some door prizes to give away. And one of those door prizes was for the best question. So I'm going to put Brian on the spot.
Oh, man.
And see if he has a choice. Otherwise, we'll take something from the crowd.
I'm going to give it to the crowd. I want the crowd to decide who it was.
All right, sounds good. So, do we have any nominations for the best question?
Yes. Everybody nominating themselves.
So your question was what again?
Just about statistical significance, sample size.
Sample size.
Yeah.
All right. For the first choice, let's have a show of hands. Okay. For the second one. Okay, I think we know who won. All right, congratulations. First door prize goes here. What's your name? David Michelle. Awesome. Okay, so I think Prabhakar will be delivering on that door prize for you. The other thing, if you haven't already done so, Product Austin on Twitter, at Product Austin. Please feel free to follow it. Also, if you could open up your web browsers, if you're able to here, give you a second. You're going to go to bit.ly/growth-machine, bit.ly/growth-machine, all lowercase. And there we have a survey on what you thought of this event. And so please complete it. It's fairly short. Okay. So while you're continuing to fill that out, there's parking validation at the front desk in case you drove here. And don't forget to check out craftsmanpm.com. And that's it. Again, thank you.